Tourists go to new places to experience them, to take photos and collect memories. They don't expect the location itself to become the last thing they're remembered for. These are stories of tourists who came to visit and became part of the place forever. It was April 14th, 2018, in Hanoi, Vietnam, on a narrow residential street in the city's Old Quarter. By late afternoon, the street was already busy. Small cafes lined both sides of the railway tracks, their tables set just inches from the steel rails. Locals passed through on foot. Tourists gathered with phones and cameras, waiting for something they had seen countless times online, a train moving through a street that looked far too small to hold it. One of those tourists was Emily Hartman, 27 years old, visiting from Portland, Oregon. She worked as a freelance graphic designer and had just finished a long contract before deciding to travel alone through Southeast Asia. Friends later said she was careful and organized in her everyday life, but more willing to push boundaries while traveling. She documented nearly everything: short clips, photos, quiet moments meant for memory rather than attention. Her phone was almost always in her hand, recording where she had been. Emily spent 3 days in Hanoi, exploring markets, temples, and cafes, filming small details as she went. Train Street came up again and again, on blogs, travel vlogs, and social media reels, showing trains sliding past tourists by inches. Nearly every clip showed the same scene: people pressed against walls, phones raised, trains roaring through without incident. The danger, when mentioned, was treated as controlled, safe if you stood to the side, safe if you knew when to move. That afternoon, Emily chose a cafe directly beside the tracks, one that advertised front-row views. The staff were used to this moment. Trains passed several times a day, and many of those passes were filmed from every angle imaginable. Regulars barely looked up anymore. When the horn sounded, tables were nudged back, chairs scraped the concrete, and customers flattened themselves against the walls. Then, the street returned to normal, until the next train. This cafe sat in one of the tightest sections of the street. The gap between the rail and the wall was barely wide enough for a person to stand sideways, shoulders turned, back flat against brick. Small tables and stools were placed carefully, the same way every day. Staff repeated the same warning they always did. A train was coming around 6:20 p.m. Stay close to the wall, don't step forward, don't move once it arrives. Emily ordered a drink and set her phone on the table, already recording. Around her, other tourists checked camera settings and switched to video. Some tested selfies, others held their phones out toward the tracks, ready to capture the moment. Several people nearby were live streaming. The mood was relaxed, almost rehearsed. Everyone had seen this scene online before, and many were there to recreate it. When the horn sounded in the distance, the shift was visible on camera. Cafe workers stood and waved their arms, urging people back. Chairs scraped. People pressed themselves flatter against the walls. Some moved immediately. Others waited, phones still raised, wanting the train closer before stepping aside. Emily stood and moved back as instructed, her phone still recording. When she checked the screen, the framing wasn't right. Part of the train would be blocked by the buildings. She leaned forward slightly, stretching her arm out to widen the shot. Witnesses later said she appeared focused on the screen, adjusting her position by inches, not watching the train itself. The engine sound grew louder quickly. Vibrations shook the ground. Wind rushed down the street ahead of the train. Voices rose, some shouting warnings, others yelling for people to move back. Several of these moments were later seen on phone videos and cafe security footage, showing how fast the space filled with noise and motion. As the train entered the narrowest part of the street, Emily leaned just a few inches farther forward. It was a small movement, barely noticeable on its own. But in that space, inches were the difference between safety and impact. The side of the train clipped her shoulder. She lost balance, was pulled toward the train, and struck again before collapsing near the track edge. The train continued through, unable to stop in time. Multiple phones captured the moment, some shaking, some dropping mid-recording. Screams followed as the cars passed. When the last carriage cleared the street, people ran forward. Cafe staff reached her first. Several tourists stood frozen, still holding their phones. Others dropped them onto the pavement. Emily did not move. Emergency services were called immediately. Police and medical responders arrived within minutes, clearing the street and pushing back onlookers as a medic assessed her injuries. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Authorities later confirmed she died from severe blunt force trauma caused by contact with the train. The train itself had been operating normally. Investigators reviewed witness statements, cafe security cameras, and multiple phone recordings taken from different angles. The footage showed Emily stepping beyond the safe clearance zone as the train entered the street. That evening, cafes along the tracks were temporarily closed. Tables nearest the rails were removed. Barriers were added in the narrowest sections. Warnings were issued again. It was July 9th, 2015, in Pamplona, Spain, just after sunrise. The narrow streets around the old city were already packed with runners dressed in white and red, pressed shoulder to shoulder behind the wooden barriers. The cobblestones were slick from cleaning crews and spilled drinks from the night before. Above the noise of the crowd, loudspeakers repeated the same instructions that had been given every morning of the festival. Keep running, don't stop, don't turn back, and stay inside the protected zones. Among the runners was Ethan Ward, a 32-year-old tourist from Manchester, England. Ethan worked in IT support and lived a fairly routine life back home. He played football on weekends, went to the gym a few times a week, and described himself as fit but not reckless. This trip to Europe was meant to be a break before settling into a more stable phase of life. He was traveling with two friends he'd known since university, and the running of the bulls had been the highlight they talked about most. None of them had ever taken part in an event like this. They'd watched videos online for years, short clips of runners sprinting ahead of the herd, people cheering from balconies, and close calls that looked thrilling rather than dangerous. Ethan, in particular, talked often about wanting proof that he'd been there. He joked about getting one good photo in the middle of it all, something he could post later as evidence that he'd done it. That morning, the three friends lined up near the Ayuntamiento section, one of the busiest parts of the course. Wooden barriers boxed in the street, scarred from past runs. Officials walked the route, checking exits and repeating the same rules. Keep moving, don't stop, don't turn back, and don't use phones. Warning signs with crossed-out cameras were posted along the walls. Ethan stood with his friends near the barrier, adjusting his shoes as they reviewed their plan one last time. They would run a short stretch, stay to the side, and exit early through a safe gap. Compared to others planning to run the full route, it felt cautious and under control. When the first rocket fired, the atmosphere changed instantly. A deep cheer rolled through the street, followed by movement in every direction at once. People leaned forward, bracing themselves. Shoes scraped against the stones as runners pushed off. Seconds later, the second rocket went up. That sound carried a different weight. It meant the bulls had been released. The sound of hooves rolled down the street, distant at first, then rapidly closing in. The ground vibrated as the herd approached. Ethan and his friends began running together, but the crowd quickly split them apart. Bodies pressed in close, and runners stumbled and recovered without stopping. As the street tightened, exits filled fast. Shouts echoed off the walls, mixed with the crack of hooves and horns scraping wood. Ethan looked back more than once, trying to judge how close the bulls were. Around him, people peeled off toward doorways and gaps, and the run dissolved into chaos, where even a moment of hesitation could be fatal. Ethan reached a stretch where the barriers closed in tighter than he expected. Instead of pushing forward with the flow, he stepped sideways into a small space between the barrier and the running line. Witnesses said he pulled out his phone and raised it, angling it toward the approaching bulls. People nearby began yelling. Several waved their arms, shouting at him to move. In crowd footage later reviewed, Ethan can be seen looking up from his screen, hesitating for a split second, then trying to step back into the lane. He never made it. A bull in the center of the herd veered slightly toward the barrier, drawn by the sudden movement. Ethan was half-turned when the animal struck him from the side. The horn entered low in his chest and lifted him off his feet. He was pinned briefly against the wooden barrier as the bull continued forward, then thrown hard onto the street as the rest of the herd thundered past. His phone skidded across the cobblestones and came to rest near the curb. Its screen shattered. When the street finally cleared, runners and officials rushed toward him, but the damage had already been done. Later that day, officials confirmed that Ethan Ward died from severe internal injuries caused by the goring. The section of the route where he was struck was temporarily closed, while organizers reviewed crowd flow and barrier spacing. In the days that followed, festival officials increased patrols along the course, removed several informal standing gaps near the barriers, and expanded pre-run briefings that explicitly banned phones and filming on the route. It was June 27, 2017, near the edge of Grand Canyon National Park in northern Arizona. By late morning, the heat had already settled in. The sky was clear, the air bone dry, and the temperature was climbing toward the high 90s. From the main viewpoints, tourists leaned on railings, took photos, and moved on, most planning only short stops before returning to air-conditioned cars. Among them was Hannah Kruger, 29 years old, visiting from Hamburg, Germany. She worked as a primary school teacher and was known among friends as organized, practical, and cautious. This trip through the United States was something she had planned carefully months in advance. She traveled with her boyfriend and another couple, and their itinerary was built around efficiency. Early starts, clear driving routes, well-known attractions, and short stops that fit neatly between long hours on the road. None of them considered themselves hikers or adventurers. They were active and healthy, but their comfort came from structure. They trusted park brochures, visitor maps, and posted signs, believing that popular destinations were designed to be safe if you followed the rules. That morning, the group arrived at a busy overlook near the canyon rim. The paved platform was crowded with visitors leaning over the railing, taking turns for photos. Tour buses emptied passengers in waves, and the air was filled with voices, camera shutters, and the sound of wind moving through the open space. Warning signs were posted along the entrance to the viewpoint, reminding visitors about extreme heat, dehydration, and the danger of leaving marked paths. Like many tourists, the group glanced at them but didn't linger. They weren't planning to go far, just a quick look, a few photos, and back to the car. As they moved along the edge of the platform, the crowd thickened near the railing. People waited impatiently, stepping around one another for a clear view. A few steps away from the noise, the group noticed a narrow dirt path branching off from the paved area. It wasn't marked on the official map, but the ground was packed down, with clear footprints pressed into the dust. The path led away from the crowd, following the rim at a slight angle. It didn't look dangerous or steep. It looked like something many people had used before. One of them mentioned seeing photos online taken from a quiet overlook in the same area. Images showing a wide, uninterrupted view into the canyon, no railings, no people in the frame. Compared to the busy platform behind them, the side path felt inviting. It promised space, silence, and a better photo without the constant shuffle of tourists. They paused for a moment, weighing the choice. The path didn't disappear into rough terrain. It stayed level and visible, and the canyon rim remained in sight. It didn't feel like breaking the rules. It felt like stepping slightly off to the side of an already crowded space. They agreed it would be quick. Walk out a short distance, take a few photos, and turn back. No one thought of it as leaving the viewpoint. To them, it felt like they were still in it, just a few steps beyond the edge of the crowd. At first, the path felt safe. The ground was firm, the rim stayed in view, and they walked casually, stopping for photos. But the heat built fast. With no shade and limited water, the single track faded into several faint lines, each looking equally worn. When they turned around, nothing stood out as the way back. Still believing the overlook was close, they continued. Hannah walked slightly ahead, sweating but calm. Near the rim, the ground changed. What looked solid was loose gravel over stone. Her foot slid, and she fell forward, dropping several feet onto a lower rock shelf. The fall didn't send her over the edge, but the impact was violent. Witnesses later said they heard a sharp, unnatural sound as her leg struck first. She screamed immediately. When they reached her, she was conscious but unable to stand. Both legs were twisted at odd angles, clearly broken. They tried to help her sit up, but any movement caused intense pain. Hannah began to shake, her breathing fast and shallow. Blood pooled beneath one leg where bone had broken the skin. The heat made everything worse. She could not be moved safely, and the narrow, uneven terrain made carrying her impossible. One friend climbed higher to find a signal and managed to place a fragmented emergency call. They struggled to describe their position, off an unmarked path near the rim, with no visible landmarks. The call dropped repeatedly. As time passed, Hannah's condition worsened. Pain and shock set in. Her skin grew pale beneath the sunburn, and her responses slowed. She drifted in and out of awareness, asking the same questions, then falling silent. They tried to shade her with clothing and ration the last of the water, but the heat and injuries were overwhelming. By the time a helicopter located them hours later, Hannah Kruger had died where she fell. Rangers later stated that the broken legs alone were survivable, but the combination of severe fractures, blood loss, shock, and prolonged exposure in extreme heat left no chance. After the incident, park officials added stronger barriers and warning signs near that viewpoint and increased patrols to keep visitors from following unmarked photo paths. It was August 3, 2018, on a narrow dirt track near Kafue National Park in Zambia. The sun was already high, and the morning heat was settling over the tall grass and low shrubs that bordered the road. Dust hung lightly in the air as an open safari vehicle rolled away from camp, carrying 6 tourists and a local guide into one of the park's less crowded areas. Among the group was Linda Carver, a 68-year-old tourist from Vancouver, Canada. Linda was a retired nurse who had spent decades working long shifts in hospitals before finally stepping away from her career. This safari was something she had planned for years, her personal retirement gift to herself. She had joined a small group tour so she wouldn't have to navigate the park alone and trusted the guides completely. Linda loved photography and often chose seats near the front of vehicles so she could get clear views of wildlife. The night before, she had written in her travel journal that seeing elephants up close was the one experience she wanted most from the trip. Physically, Linda was mostly healthy, though she lived with arthritis in her knees that made climbing, standing for long periods, and sudden movements uncomfortable. Because of that, she preferred wildlife drives where she could remain seated and observe without strain. She was careful by nature. Other guests described her as attentive during briefings, someone who listened closely and asked practical questions rather than pushing limits. She trusted the guide's judgment and believed that following instructions was the safest way to experience animals she had only seen in documentaries. That morning began like dozens of other safari drives. Before leaving camp, the guide reviewed the basic rules again. Stay seated at all times, keep voices low, do not lean out of the vehicle, and never make sudden movements if animals were nearby. Linda nodded along with the others, resting her camera on her lap. For the first hour, the drive followed wider dirt roads where vehicles could pass each other and turn around easily. The group saw antelope grazing near the brush and several birds perched along the roadside. Each stop felt relaxed and controlled, the kind of calm experience Linda had hoped for. Eventually, the guide turned off the main road onto a much narrower track. Tall grass rose on both sides, brushing close to the vehicle. The ruts showed the path was used regularly, but it was clear there was little room to maneuver. Turning around would take time, and backing up would require careful alignment. The vehicle rolled forward slowly until the guide eased to a stop. Ahead, a small group of elephants, females and younger animals, moved steadily across the open ground. The guide judged the distance to be safe and shut off the engine to reduce noise. Inside the vehicle, the mood stayed quiet and focused. Linda lifted her camera and began taking photos, framing the elephants as they passed through the grass. She adjusted her lens, careful not to stand or lean forward. No one spoke above a whisper. It felt like one of those rare moments safari travelers hope for, close enough to see detail, far enough to feel secure. Then, the guide noticed movement to the left. The grass shifted again, heavier this time. A large bull elephant stepped into view, much closer than expected. His presence changed the atmosphere instantly. Dark fluid streaked down his shoulders, and the sides of his head were swollen, signs of must, when male elephants can become unpredictable and aggressive. The guide's posture stiffened. Without raising his voice, he reached for the ignition, preparing to restart the engine and reverse slowly to give the bull space. The calm of the moment narrowed into tension, and everyone in the vehicle felt it. The engine turned over, but the vehicle didn't move right away. One rear tire spun slightly on the loose dirt before catching. In that brief pause, the bull's behavior changed. He spread his ears wide and took several deliberate steps forward, closing the distance faster than anyone expected. Tall grass bent and scraped along the side of the truck as he moved in. Inside the vehicle, the mood shifted instantly. One guest whispered for the guide to hurry. Another froze, gripping the seat frame. Linda remained leaning forward with her camera raised, centered on the elephant's head, likely focused on getting the shot rather than on how little space was left. The guide managed to ease the vehicle backward a few feet, but it wasn't enough. The bull dropped his head and charged without hesitation, The ground shook as he struck the front left corner of the truck. The impact slammed through the frame, throwing passengers sideways and knocking loose gear from the floor. Several people screamed as the vehicle rocked violently, its suspension compressing under the force. The bull didn't stop. He drove a tusk beneath the metal frame and lifted. The front end of the 4x4 rose off the ground, tilting at a sharp angle. Cameras, water bottles, and bags slid toward the low side. Linda, seated near the front on the rising side, lost her balance and slid hard toward the rail. She reached instinctively, but there was nothing to hold as the vehicle tipped further. The elephant shoved again, using his full weight. The truck rolled onto its side, crashing into the brush. In the motion, Linda was forced against an upright support bar. The weight of the vehicle, combined with the equipment mounted to the frame, came down on her upper body. She was pinned between the metal and the ground, unable to move. Other passengers later said everything happened in seconds. One impact, a lift, then the roll. They recalled hearing one short cry before the vehicle settled on its side, surrounded by flattened grass and dust, the bull stepping away as abruptly as he had charged. When the elephant finally moved away, the guide and surviving guests scrambled out and tried to reach Linda, but there was nothing they could do. Park staff arrived and confirmed that Linda Carver had died from severe crush injuries. In the weeks that followed, the tour company changed its operating rules, avoiding narrow tracks during bull-elephant sightings and increasing minimum distance requirements for vehicles. It was October 11, 2017, at the Giza Plateau just outside Cairo. The sun was already climbing, and tour buses were unloading groups near the entrance to the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Vendors called out to visitors, guides gathered their groups, and guards directed foot traffic toward the narrow entrance carved high into the pyramid's north face. From the outside, everything felt orderly, familiar, and controlled, one of the most visited tourist sites in the world. Among the visitors that morning was Thomas Adler, a 41-year-old tourist from Munich, Germany. Thomas worked as a civil engineer, specializing in historical structures and restoration projects. Friends later said this trip wasn't about photos or souvenirs. He had spent years reading about ancient construction methods, stone load distribution, and interior support systems. Seeing the pyramids in person was something he had talked about for over a decade. Thomas had arrived in Egypt alone a few days earlier. He preferred solo travel, especially for places where he wanted to move at his own pace. He stayed in a small hotel in Cairo, visited museums during his first 2 days, and saved the pyramid visit for midweek to avoid peak crowds. According to messages sent to friends, he planned to enter the Great Pyramid, walk the main passage, and study the interior angles up close. Access to the pyramid was limited and regulated. Visitors were allowed into the lower passages and the Grand Gallery, a steep, narrow corridor with low ceilings and worn stone floors. The interior was hot, poorly ventilated, and dimly lit. Metal handrails had been added to help tourists move through safely, and guards were stationed at key points to keep people on the designated route. Once inside, Thomas moved slowly. Witnesses later said he often stopped to examine the stone joints and ceiling blocks, taking photos and notes on his phone. The passage was crowded, and groups moved in waves. Pause, step forward, pause again. Guards repeatedly reminded visitors not to linger too long and to keep moving. About halfway through the interior route, Thomas began falling behind his group. According to a nearby guard, he appeared focused on the walls rather than the people ahead of him. When the guard turned to assist another group passing in the opposite direction, Thomas stepped away from the main path. Behind a partially obscured barrier used by maintenance staff, there was a narrow side opening. It was not marked for public access. The opening led into a steep, uneven passage with no handrails, no lighting beyond spillover from the main corridor, and stone surfaces worn smooth by time. At some point, Thomas entered this passage. Several visitors later said they remembered hearing a sharp metallic scrape echo through the pyramid, followed by a heavy, hollow thud. At the time, it didn't stand out. Inside the pyramid, sound behaves strangely. Voices bounce off stone, footsteps echo from different directions, and noises overlap in ways that make distance and location hard to judge. People assumed it was a dropped flashlight, a loose handrail, or someone slipping on the smooth floor. No one thought it was an accident. The restricted passage Thomas had entered was not designed for foot traffic. The floor angled downward more sharply than the main corridors, and the limestone blocks had been worn smooth by centuries of contact. Even with good shoes, traction was limited. Investigators later determined that Thomas stepped onto a slanted edge where two stones met. His foot slid forward almost immediately. With no handhold nearby and the slope working against him, he lost balance and slid several feet before dropping into a vertical maintenance void concealed below the passage. The drop was estimated at around 20 feet. As he fell, Thomas struck the stone walls, first with his shoulder and head, then again as his body twisted. He landed wedged between uneven blocks at the bottom of the void, trapped in a narrow space where his legs could not extend fully and his upper body was pinned at an angle. The position left no room to roll, stand, or climb. Evidence suggested he may have survived the fall for a short time. Scuff marks and disturbed dust indicated slight movement after impact, but the space absorbed sound, and any calls for help would have been muffled by thick stone. From the main corridor above, nothing could be heard. Tour groups continued passing through just a few meters away, unaware that someone had fallen below them. Hours passed. Tour guides led visitors in and out along their scheduled routes. The pyramid remained busy, with no immediate sign that anyone was missing. It wasn't until late afternoon, when staff reviewed exit counts and tour rosters, that a discrepancy appeared. One visitor had entered but never exited with any group. Guards began retracing the interior route, checking rest areas and side corridors. Near the maintenance barrier, they noticed disturbed dust, fresh scuff marks, and a flashlight beam reflecting from below where no light should have been visible. Maintenance staff were called in to inspect the area more closely. That was when they realized someone had fallen into the hidden void. Far below the path, tourists walked every day, unseen and unheard. Using handheld flashlights and radios, site guards and local responders traced the disturbed dust and scrape marks downward through the interior shaft. The marks ended at a lower void where the passage narrowed and dropped sharply. There, they found Thomas wedged between uneven stone blocks, his body pinned at an angle that made immediate access difficult. He was unresponsive, and the confined space prevented responders from repositioning him quickly or administering aid beyond a basic check. With no safe way to move equipment or personnel into the cavity, they focused on stabilizing the area and documenting the scene. Recovery inside the pyramid took hours. The interior corridors were too narrow and steep for stretchers, ropes, or lifting gear. Workers had to carefully free his body by hand, inching it back through the same tight passages tourists typically squeeze through on foot. Each turn required slow coordination to avoid further injury or damage to the structure. The process drew attention to how limited emergency access is inside the monument, even during routine operations. Thomas Adler was later pronounced dead from head trauma and internal injuries consistent with a fall onto stone at close range. The following day, authorities temporarily closed interior access to the Great Pyramid while officials reviewed the circumstances. Barriers near maintenance passages were reinforced, additional warning signage was added in low-visibility areas, and guards were instructed to increase patrols around blind spots where visitors might wander off designated routes. The incident was circulated in internal safety briefings as a reminder that, despite centuries of study and tourism, the pyramid's interior remains hazardous, and that a single misstep beyond controlled areas can leave no room for rescue. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this.